it's him. And if I look like a mess, it's because I wasn't really planning to make a video, so I did not pull myself together in any kind of way, and it's evening, so I've got lamps on, so sorry for the lighting and everything else, but I just was reminded, having been pulled into an evangelical cult while I was an undergrad, and I thought that would be a fun story to tell, if anybody's interested. To start with, and if you've seen my videos on the books Exvangelicals or Dan McClellan's book, then you might have heard some of this already. Both my parents grew up Catholic. I started out Catholic until my mom was born again when I was about 8. So then life changed radically saved. And we started going to a very small church that met part of the time in a local bank that let us use their lobby and their upstairs conference rooms on Sundays. It was an interesting time. I went from something very kind of quiet, and I went from going to CCD and things like that to like this kind of church with, guitars and tambourines, and just very different, right? Anyway, my mother eventually became a youth pastor, like for the high schoolers. Life went on. I had to go to church Wednesday nights, Sunday mornings, and Sunday evenings. So there was a lot of church happening. We eventually moved away from that town, found another small church where my mom could be youth pastor. That was a whole thing for a while. I went to a Christian school for a while, the kind where you had to kneel on the floor to show that your skirt was long enough and that kind of thing. Yes, Crowley, that's right. My mom was the school and church secretary. My mom, in case you're not getting the drift here, my mom is the kind of person who is never happier than when she's more or less meddling in things. We would hop from church to church because churches would implode after factions would form, and usually my mom was in there stirring some of that up. By the time I was in high school, my mom had come to the understanding that it was impossible to force me to go to church if I didn't want to. I still went with her sometimes. At this point, she was going to Church on the Rock, which is one of those mega churches like in Rockwall, Texas. And so I would sometimes go with her. The bigger churches were better because she really couldn't insert herself into things and cause a lot of division. My dad sometimes went to churches with us, but really deep down he really was still just Catholic. And he liked the quietness of Catholicism, and he liked that it had an established hierarchy that my mother could not damage. So in high school, I was sometimes going to church with my mom, but I was also sometimes going to church with some of my school friends who went to like Methodist churches, I want to say. Pretty sure it was a Methodist church. My first real boyfriend was from that church, and we met on a church function. I went to various church outings with these friends. My mom got involved in something called Walk to Emmaus, and then sent me on what's called a chrysalis, which is a weekend, church weekend thing for teens. I mean, I was in it, like, I was pretty much fully immersed. It's interesting because I don't know how much I believed, but it was a big part of my social system, like my social construct, and therefore I just kind of was in it, not really giving it a lot of thought, because let's face it, the church does not encourage you to give it a lot of thought. They're going to tell you a thing, you're going to believe it, you're going to go, okay, believe what they tell you, do what they say, yada, yada, yada. But then, then I went away to college. I went away to the University of Texas at Austin. And I was going to be lonely, so I started looking for clubs to join. And of course, I came across something called Longhorn Life, which was a church organization. I was going to fit right in. And I had never felt more sucked into a group of people than I did with this group. And I was so grateful to almost immediately have found this group of people. There was always some function, and there were meetings at people's houses, and there was, we'll give you a ride, because I didn't have a car. Oh, we'll give you a ride to church on Sundays, and, and this and that. So again, I was fully immersed. And I don't think I realized at the time, not until much later, that this was part of the Great Commission ministries. Now, I had never heard of Great Commission ministries. I knew what the Great Commission was. I had heard of that. That's a very typical evangelical biblical concept. I lived in the dorms through my junior year. My senior year, you can't stay in the dorms. They didn't have enough. So seniors had to find somewhere else to live. I still had no car. So I was going to need to live somewhere on the bus system or within walking distance. Well, there was this really cruddy apartment complex that was within walking distance of campus. It was kind of literally right across a main road. And a bunch of the kids from Longhorn Life lived there, 4 to an apartment. And there were we had girls' apartments and guys' apartments, and, and I mean, we made up a good chunk of this complex that was this close to being condemned, this complex that I nearly died in from a gas leak when our oven started leaking. This place was awful, okay? To the point that when my parents dropped me off to help me move in, my dad pulled over to the side of the road after leaving, apparently. They told me this story later, and cried, saying he'd left his daughter in a hovel. But I moved in with 3 other Longhorn Life students. And immediately there were going to be these rules where we had to have dinners together, and we had to hold each other accountable. And we were always having, either in our apartment or in one of the apartments, there was always these different meetings and things going on. It was busy all the time. Now, I'm an introvert, and I'm somebody who, as an only child, really does need a lot of time to myself and alone. I had a roommate who sang opera and watched the 1995 Pride and Prejudice on repeat. Now, to be fair, the 1995 Pride and Prejudice is amazing. And she sang beautifully, but you could be across the street from the apartment complex and hear her, and the windows weren't even open. She had a voice. I mean, it was an operatic voice. There were a lot of complicated relationship things going on. And, it's already complicated when you're in high school and college and there's feelings, but then you add the layer of Christianity and the rules and restrictions, and again, the accountability. And yeah, it was something. And at some point, because I'm me, I was just I'm not going to live by these rules. You can't make me. So one time I was supposed to be at, group dinner, and I went out to a movie with friends, and I got sat down and I got a talking to about it. And I was just I'm 20. What? You can't, what are you going to do? And then they would start trying to take me to these classes. And they wanted me to come stand with them out on street corners and proselytize. They wanted me to work through some kind of system that they had. A bunch of the students in the summer would go up to like, I don't know, Virginia Beach or Myrtle Beach or someplace like that and have these summer things that they did at some kind of camp or retreat or something. And it was a big deal if you were one of the people going to this thing. And, it was then when they were trying to force me to go stand on street corners and talk to people about God, the Great Commission. I just was like, you know what? Having gone to college and learned stuff and learned to start thinking about things a little more critically, I had already, begun backing away slowly from some of the church stuff. And I'm very much a believer in religion and belief being a personal thing. It's a contract that you have with whatever holy being you choose to make a contract with, if any. And nobody says you have to make a contract with one either. I had come to this point in my thinking and in my belief system, and I had made other friends too. Friends where I worked and friends at college that were not in part of this church group. And I had absolutely failed to drag them into this church group either. And I'm sure that was frowned upon. For me, it was like, no, I'm not going to make them come to church with me. When I was in high school, I was always mortified because I would have friends come over and then my mom would be like, okay, we're going to church. And I was like, my friend doesn't want to go to, well, we're going. And so my friend would get dragged to church with us. And I'd be like, I'm sorry. I don't know. You're in high school. You shouldn't have to go, right? And what brought this up? What brought this all back to the surface is that I spoke to my mother yesterday, and she's like, how is your relationship with the Lord? Like, how's your walk with God right now? Or, where are you spiritually or something like that? I haven't completely cut off contact with my parents, but I have begun making that contact far less frequent. Definitely have put up a few more walls. Again, it's hard when you're an only child and you kind of have this sense of responsibility for these people as they age or whatever. But the fact that they won't use one of my children's preferred pronouns, at that point, I'm like, okay, well, then you're just not going to have a relationship with them. And you're going to have a very limited relationship with me. And, I don't want to hear, oh, I never get to see my grandkids. I never get to talk to my grandkids. I'm like, yeah. You don't. And that's your own fault. At that point, I finished out that year in that apartment complex. And it was my senior year anyway, so I was graduating. Luckily, I was already doing work for Linda Obst. So I had a regular job. I had work for Linda Obst. And so I was almost never in the apartment anyway. And then I just got out. Yeah, that was the point at which I was like, okay, I've made my peace with my beliefs. What's funny to me is that if you go on Wikipedia and you look up Great Commission ministries, they will list Longhorn Life, which my understanding is no longer exists at UT, or if it does, it's got some other name. I guess stuff imploded sometime after I had already left, because it sounds like a lot of people do consider it a cult. And yeah, I mean, they were trying to control what I did, how I thought, who I spent time with. That pretty much checks a lot of those boxes, right? So if it wasn't a full-blown cult, it was definitely very close. I mean, they wanted their claws in me and just about anybody. They really frowned on the fact that I watched things like Highlander. Sorry. the X-Files. So that's my little story of escaping. This is kind of all over the place. Sorry, but I had that memory, that memory was sparked. And I just felt like, you know what? I'll just make a quick little video about it. About how I went as an undergrad, got sucked in. They do it by targeting people who are lonely and looking to belong somewhere. Isn't that how all cults work? You know, I was one of those, and it was familiar to me. It had the added benefit of being actually very familiar. So I had a vulnerability there that some people might not have had, because I didn't suspect anything until later. Like I said, I'm the nightmare of these people. A good Christian, God-fearing, loving girl goes away, gets educated, and turns her back on. I didn't turn my back on. I turned my back on organized religion and church politics and stuff like that. But I didn't turn my back on God, and there is a difference. And they don't want to believe that, because they want to believe that they are the authority. But they're not. I am the boss of me, and I will decide what kind of relationship I have with whichever higher being or beings I choose. So yeah, that's my story. That's it for now. Until next time, take care.